Hey guys, what is up? Super K-Man Rocks here, and I'm here for my LCK week number 3 overview and analysis video here in this summer split. We are really starting to get into the thick of things in terms of the summer split. We're starting to figure out which teams have changed their trajectory a little bit, and more commonly, which teams have stayed basically on the same trajectory they were already on. If you want to know my thoughts and opinions on everything that's happened in the first couple of weeks, you can check out the playlist up on the iCard right now. That's week 1, that's week 2, that's also my pre-split primer. A lot of things have gone basically chalk. A lot of things are not really huge surprises. That's kind of been the case in the LCK for the entire year. I will say it's a bit more dynamic here in summer than in spring, so I'm excited for that. But is that trend going to continue in week number 3, or will things kind of just play out normally as expected like they did for a majority of the spring split? Well, we'll find out now. Of course, if you are new here, what we do on this channel is go series by series, talking about the advantages and the disadvantages that each team was able to generate. I'll be giving a player of the series and a dud of the series for each individual series, and at the end of the week, we will be giving a player of the week and a dud of the week to kind of tie everything into a nice, neat little bow. Of course, I will also be updating my personal power rankings from number 1 to number 10 to kind of give you guys an idea of where I think these teams end up falling. Spoiler alert, there probably won't be a ton of changes this week, but you probably already knew that if you were following the LCK. So, with that preamble out of the way, why don't we jump right into the analysis, and that means starting with, of course, day number 1. And we kick day 1 off with a pretty big stomp here between T1 and DRX. This was not a particularly close series. T1 absolutely annihilated them. This isn't really a huge surprise. T1, ever since the 2022 World Finals, has played really hard against DRX regardless of the talent level of that roster. They destroyed them every single time they played them last year, like historically so, and then obviously that has carried over this year. A 21-minute win in game number 2. I mean, this was just utter domination. It was aggressive picks coming over from the side of T1. Nidalee and Diana in the jungle. Zeri coming out from Gumayusi, something he really doesn't play all that much. And Rakan coming out from KT. This is an aggressive draft from T1 in game 2, and they just said, screw it, we're like so much better than you that we can come out and just absolutely dominate this game no matter what we want to do. We're going to run it early, and we are going to close it fast. And this is what T1 does against teams that they are better than. I'm still kind of concerned about them against like the best teams in the world, and I say that from a T1 like expectation. Like, I'm not concerned about them. Their floor is like the 4th best team in the world. Like, minimum, that's probably what they are, but I think in terms of expectations, people expect them to be better than that, and they've kind of just been inconsistent in that regard. That being said, when they win hard, and this is a good example of that. So we'll talk about it. Player of the series is going to go to Owner in the jungle. He's actually been really good this split. I don't know how much of it I want to like fully believe, because again, Owner's always been the kind of player that's really dominated against bad teams and has looked a little bit more shaky against the best teams in the world. My question with Owner has never been his ability to play super well on a game-to-game basis in the regular season, although there are times where that has been a question mark. It's more so been the fact that he really benefits a lot from getting to play with Zeus and Faker and Guma and KT, lanes that are constantly winning, lanes that constantly have pressure, and I wanted to see him take some of these games into his hand and be a bit more of the actual creator that we know he can be in the jungle with champions like Lee Sin and Nidalee and Diana that he's played a lot of in solo queue, and he's kind of starting to bring that out more. I think this meta definitely helps that. He's off of things like Sejuani and Maokai super regularly, and he's finally getting to show that he can control the early game on his own, and I think he's been really good so far this split. I'm not going to try and sit here and pretend that all of my concerns and fears around Owner are just gone now, that they don't exist anymore, but I don't feel nearly as kind of conflicted about him as I did going into the split. Hopefully he can keep this up and kind of get back to where people are expecting him to be trajectory-wise, because remember when he came into the league, people thought he was going to take over and be one of the best junglers in the world. He is one of the best junglers in the world, but I don't think it's been as unanimous as people anticipated. This is on pace to be maybe his best regular season that he's had. Obviously, the rest of this team is also really good. Gumayusi was at like 13 CS a minute, like something ridiculous on Zeri. It truly felt incomprehensible how much he was dominating that bot lane matchup, and obviously, you know, this is the thing that Teddy does. He likes to get in these trade-offs. He will get a lot of resources himself, but he will also give over a lot of resources to the enemy team. He doesn't really contest all that much. He's just not a player that's really all that interested in doing that, and so a player like Guma, who is very adept at being able to get those resources, can, you know, just win the 2v2 and really accumulate them faster, especially because his team is winning. So, really good series from Guma. KT was awesome, especially in that first game on the Nautilus. A lot of those hooks were super influential. I thought he was also also really good on the recon. I very much considered him for player of the series. Zeus won the top lane matchup. Faker certainly won the mid lane matchup. This was just kind of a demolition across the board for T1, as you can expect when you win in 21 minutes, when you go 2-0. This was not a close series. You can kind of point out everybody on the side of T1 and say positive things, but this was a really good sign that hopefully they are starting to stabilize. Their only loss was to Gen.G, and, you know, that's a pretty good loss to have considering how Gen.G have been able to play. This still very much feels like clearly the second best team in the LCK and easily a top 3 team in the world. And then for DRX on the other side, you know, there's a lot of positivity, I think, surrounding this team because they're 500. They were above 500 in terms of game score coming into this week, and I think that that is certainly a better result than anything that happened in the spring split for them, because spring was an utter disaster. But, you know, they're not T1. They can't compete with T1. This is not an upset. I am a little bit frustrated by them putting Rascal in game number 2 here to play the Malphite. I don't really understand why you wouldn't just stick with Frog. I get that Frog is a pretty horrible laner, and it's something that he has to work on, but Rascal's bad in every phase of the game right now, and at least Frog is someone that theoretically could give you some upside. Like, Rascal is not a player that is particularly good at the current moment. He was entirely useless in game 2, and I'm not going to say they got blown out because they put Rascal in, because that's ridiculous. Like, obviously that was not the case. He went 0-0-0 in game number 2, but he's not someone that's going to push the issue. At least Frog is a decent team fighter, and that's kind of the scouting report on him. I don't know if Rascal even does that, even if Rascal is a bit more stable in lane. So not a decision I would personally have gone to. I very much debated whether to give Dud of the series to jungle or mid. For DRX, I ended up giving it to Yehu in the mid lane because his quirky was just horrible. His positioning was horrible. His ability to just go toe-to-toe in lane with Faker was horrible. I get it. It's Faker. He dominates matchups, and, you know, he's one of the best players in the world, but Yehu's actually a player that I've been pretty not excited about, but, like, I feel like he's okay. I feel like he's, like, a competent LCK mid laner, somewhere around the vein of, like, a closer or a bulldog. I think as an interesting prospect, I think that that's a fair way to end up classifying him. Maybe a bit worse, but this was a really bad performance, and, you know, we'll see if this ends up being a trend. If he really struggles against the best mid laners in the league, then maybe he doesn't deserve to be classified in that same group. Sponge was also really bad. 2 games of Zyra, where he just got completely outjungled in terms of tempo by Owner. Teddy and Plata were generally fine. Again, they didn't make any major errors. They had a pretty standard Teddy and Plata kind of series where, you know, they were just a little bit too passive. They could have done a bit more to actually push the tempo, but the rest of the side was losing. I'm not going to blame the bot lane for this one. This was jungle mid's fault. They were the worst part of the team, and DRX lost because of it, but this is not an upset. They expected this loss. They're going into the second half of this week at 2-3, and really all they want to do is kind of just be the best of the rest. There's still a chance for them to finish in top 6 if one of those teams, cough, cough, KT Rolster, ends up really underperforming, even if they only beat the teams that they're supposed to from this point onwards, and this was not a win that they needed to get. But for T1, really glad to see them continue to look good. 8-3 is a very good record. I do think that they have stabilized in the sense of there were some concerns after their loss to Gen.G because they lost so hard that they wouldn't be able to, you know, mentally be as dominant. You know, sometimes they're a bit slow starters in summer, and they weren't as dominant in the regular season last split as, you know, maybe one would expect because it's T1. There are a lot of factors, I think, going into why maybe the expectation for them was, you know, top 5 in the world, but no, they're top 3 in the world. That is clearly where they're at, especially after that MSI performance. This is a very, very good team, and I especially like the stepping up of a couple of the players that I've really highlighted. Then moving on now to our second series of day number 1, and it's a top-of-the-table clash. It just was never going to be all that close. It's Hanwha Life Esports taking on Gen.G, and Gen.G is going to pick up the 2-0. They moved to 5-0, 10-0 to start this split. They've been untouchable even since last split. They've only lost 1 series the entirety of this year. In any context, in best of 3 and best of 5, it hasn't really mattered. This team has been unbeatable, and they continue that run here. Hanwha Life is a decent team. They have a couple of good things going for them. I think a couple of their players played really well in this series, and I really do want to highlight the positives that happened for HLE here, but it's Gen.G. I mean, this team is untouchable as long as they are playing their style and their game. There really is nobody on the planet right now that can go toe-to-toe with them in terms of what they want to do. They are that much further ahead than every other team in the world right now. It's not even just, oh, you know, they might win Worlds. It's like, this team is looking at Worlds as, if we don't win it, we've majorly underperformed, which is a pretty crazy place to be in expectation-wise, but it's because of the performance of these players so far this year. Player of the series here, I mean, you could give it to quite a few people. I give it to Canyon. If you want to give it to Pays for that Ezreal game in game 2, go ahead. If you want to give it to Chovy for doing 1 billion damage on Corki in game number 2, go ahead. Like, there's so many easy options here for Gen.G, and that's the problem. That's why it's so difficult to face Gen.G, is because they're one of the few teams that genuinely can just win everywhere, and they have have players that are also willing to sacrifice resources. Typically speaking, when you're looking at a team that is just kind of carries or primary alphas like everywhere, people who are used to being strong side everywhere on the map, then oftentimes somebody is going to play a little bit worse because they're going to have to adopt a weak side role, and it might not be nearly as effective. But the problem is that Gen.G actually has players that are familiar with playing both strong side and weak side. You have someone in Keen who has done both throughout a majority of his career. You have someone in Chovy who has very much learned how to play weak side over the past year or so. Pays is basically fully weak side when he wants to be, and so you really end up in this situation where anybody can kind of take any role at any given time. They're super flexible in draft. They are super flexible in how they want to execute their mid games, and it just makes it almost impossible with their skill level to end up beating them, and that's what happened here. I gave it to Canyon because it really did feel like he was the most impactful. Of course, the Zyra in game number 1, he's the best Zyra jungle in the world. I don't think I'm really breaking any sort of ground by saying that. He might be the best jungler in the world by a large margin right now. Again, as I've said on the channel, the only jungler, in my opinion, that can even make that argument with him is Kanavi, and Kanavi's just on a significantly worse team. JD Gaming is super good, but it is a worse team than what Gen.G is, and so it's just a bit of a different circumstance. Canyon has a very real argument that he is clearly the best jungler in the world right now, and the Zyra performance in game number 1 definitely kind of proved that. He was still very good on the Talia in game number 2 as well, but like I said, Chovy's Corki just does a bit more damage. Love seeing him play Lucian. He's so flashy and aggressive on that champion. He knows exactly how to trade in terms of the mid lane matchups to generate his own advantages. Zeka did admirably to try and stay neutral in that matchup, but Chovy was just more relevant as the game continued to go on. And Pays was excellent. His Ezreal is truly one of the best in the world. It's really funny because the champions that I now associate with him are like Ezreal and Zeri, even though he came up as kind of an Aphelios player. It's very interesting to see the high mobility champions kind of become the style for Pays, the ones that can be a bit more self-sufficient, at least in the mid game. Ezreal in particular, they've really been a positive, and Pays has been unbelievably good for Gen.G. He was quote-unquote the weakness of this team in the spring split, so it's nice to see him dominate. Lehens and Keen were also good. Keen in particular, definitely the better top laner, and Lehens definitely the better support, but it's just across the board for Gen.G. I mean, there's really nothing else to say, no weaknesses. And then for HLE, they have their own problems. Right now, I think they've been relatively inconsistent. It's funny because I think the performance this week is very different from how they were losing at the beginning of the split. Like, they went 1-1 in week 1, and they didn't look all that great doing it. Doran was really the only player in week 1 that looked good under any capacity for Hanwha life, and you had players like Peanut really underperforming, and now here you are in week 3 and you're losing again, but this time it's Doran that's really underperforming, and Peanut, who's like trying to 1v9 in this game number 2 on Nidalee. He played incredibly well, but it just didn't matter after a really good week last week. I think both Peanut and Viper did a really good job in this series of attempting to keep things alive for HLE, but dud of the series has to go to Delight. I don't really know what's going on with him right now. I don't know if it's like returning back to earth, because we were a bit concerned that was going to happen after leaving Gen.G. We've seen players do really well in that organization before, only to go somewhere else and just not be as relevant. I was concerned that could potentially be Delight, but he was amazing in spring. Him and Viper were the best bot lane in the LCK in the spring split, and so with Viper continuing to play well, Delight's had a really slow start, and it's really held this team back. He is such an integral part of how they play their mid games out, that when he is not aggressive, when he's not able to actually control tempo, when he's making bad decisions like walking up to Baron Pit and just instantly dying at a pretty pivotal time, then there's really not a lot of avenues for Hanwha Life to actually fight and be good, even with Peanut and Viper playing as well as they did in this series. Doran was also very disappointing. He has not been nearly as good as he was in week number 1 over the past 2 weeks. He was not nearly as good as he was last year in spring. Still think he's fine. Like, again, I still think he gets a bad reputation considering how good he is. He's not an elite top laner. He's not an A, minus caliber top laner. He's not in the A's anywhere, but he is certainly one of the better top laners in the LCK, and somebody who is going to be consistent at being able to beat like lower tier top laners. Keen is just not that. Keen is better than him, and Doran wasn't all that useful in team fights either. Hanwha Life is still a good team, but again, they're maybe not the team that they were in spring, and I think that's a bit disappointing with the expectations they had, because I think they wanted to clearly be top 3 and to fight for top 2. Right now, it feels like they're going to be fighting for top 4. And then for Gen.G, like, clear number 1 in the world. Like, what do you want me to say? Like, there's nothing else to say when it comes to Gen.G. We've said it already. This is the best team in the world, and to proven otherwise. Then moving on now to day number 2, and we get another kind of standard series here between Nongshim, RedForce, and Dplus KIA to kick off day 2, and DK is going to pick up the win. 2 sub 27-minute games here for them to go 2-0 in the series. Not a shock, this is what we expected, but DK has been a very big pleasant surprise to me over the course of this split so far. Not because we didn't think they were going to be good, but they are better, significantly better right now than they were in the spring split. Even, factoring in their playoff run, where they were pretty good. Honestly, they played some of their best league over the course of the year in their playoff run. They were really good against KT Rolster. They put up a really good fight against Gen.G. It just didn't really matter. You know, top 3 in the LCK felt pretty untouchable by the end of Spring Split. That doesn't feel nearly as untouchable anymore. We just talked about Hanwha Life not necessarily performing as consistently well as maybe they had in the previous split, and DK has really picked up a lot of that slack. They moved to 4-1 here, and honestly, they feel like a very complete roster right now. I know some people are going to point at some of these players and say that they are liabilities. I think it's a significantly smaller problem than people like to make it out to be, and I think the biggest liability for this team in the Spring Split has maybe been their best player so far in summer, and that's Lucid in the jungle, who's going to get my player of the series. The biggest problem that Lucid had in spring is that he had absolutely no idea how to play tanks. We talked about it a lot. He was getting lost in the mid game. He was really fumbling a lot of the pressure that his team was able to generate through their lanes, specifically Showmaker, who was tremendous. Aiming and Kellen were also relatively fine. Down in the bot lane, Aiming is a pretty solid mid game player, and so you were in situations where often DK had a lot of tempo, and Lucid just didn't really know what to do with it, especially if he wasn't the one that had a lot of the gold. That's what we talk about a lot when we talk about players that just aren't used to being facilitators. Sometimes it takes a minute to understand where exactly you need to be to make sure that your laners are getting the most out of their own resources rather than you feeling like you have to continue to gather your own. I think Lucid is really starting to develop in that area a lot, and so much so that honestly his Maokai in Game 2 is one of the best Maokai games we've seen in the LCK so far this split. Just a really good progression from him individually as a player, and because he has been so active and so positive, because that growth and that, you know, development has really happened already in the summer split, you know, that's really raised the floor of what DK can offer. It's the reason that, for me, they're the number 3 team in the LCK right now, and honestly, like, T1 is not untouchable in terms of what could theoretically happen in a number 2 spot. We saw Hanwha Life beat them in the playoffs last split. A team like DK is talented enough to be able to make a run for finals if everything were to go right, and I think Lucid's development is really the key to unlocking that. He wasn't the only one who played well, though. Kingen had a really good series. That Rumble game in game number 1 was really dominant. It's always worth the caveat that he was going into Din, who, in my estimation, is by far the worst top laner in the LCK. He has just not really done or proven anything. You see a lot of people on Twitter and on Reddit that are constantly like, Din's actually been pretty good. I haven't seen it. You know, I'm glad that those people like Din's performances. I've been pretty low on him in terms of what I've seen on the Rift. I don't think he has performed well at the LCK level. He was good in Challengers League, and he does have mechanical upside. His laning, it really isn't horrible, but he doesn't know how to transition anything, and, you know, his laning's inconsistent. And so when Kingen comes out and destroys him in game number 1, it's just another like, well, Din lost again, and Kingen's not even like a star top laner, so it's definitely not ideal. Showmaker, Aiming, Kellen, they all played well. Aiming's KDA is ridiculous right now, and that's kind of always been Aiming as a player. I think he's really settled it back into that KT Rolster Aiming kind of role, where he is a really consistent late game carry, doesn't really need to do all that much in the early game, can put pressure on in the 2v2, but isn't really relied upon to win. He's not strong side in a lot of circumstances, and so he can just really kind of take it easy and then start to pop off in terms of aggressive positioning in the latter half of the game, and Kellen's also much better than people give him credit for. Showmaker's obviously great. DK looks good. They look like a team that I really am starting to believe in. I think they're becoming a lot more complete, and again, Lucid's development is really going to be key to whether or not this team can keep up this level of form. And then for Nongshim, like, this team is bad. You know, we've been talking about how they've been competitive, as they have been basically every split in their losses. They are good losers, if you will, but at some point you just have to go, actually, they're not. Like, they lose every game, and at minimum 1 or 2 players every single series look horrible for this team, and that was the case here. Guger is going to get my dud of the series down in the support position. You know, he was not great in his first stint in the LCK, and that was like 4 years ago. That was in the pandemic, and so now you're sitting here and you're like, you know, we question this addition in the offseason. You know, I very much made a I don't know what they're thinking kind of statement in the primer video, and that has turned out to be true. He just doesn't seem to be particularly good. Jiwoo continues to look amazing in terms of what he's able to do in the mid game and how he team fights. He is really the best player on this team by a large margin, and Guger is just not able to keep up, and that makes the 2v2 actually very weak for this team, which is a very, very bad situation in terms of winning games. Also, Fisher has just reverted back. EDG Fisher is here again. You know, week 1 actually looked kind of promising. He was actually doing really well in lane in terms of the 1v1 in week number 1. Ever since then, things have fallen off. He has returned back to normal. He started to play actual good LCK mid laners, and it's not really been all that good for him. The Hui, the Azir, it didn't look good, and he really struggled in spring, obviously, over in the LPL. Nothing has really changed here. Sylvie and Jiwoo continue to be like the only 2 players that are trying to do things. The Viego, I think, is generally fine for a team that's looking for any way to be able to win in the late game. And Jiwoo can win almost any situation if you give him enough time, but Din, Fisher, Guger, they're just not good enough, and Sylvie's certainly not consistent enough for this team to ever actually win games. They're probably not the worst team in the league, if only because Bro exists, but they certainly are pretty close. And then DK is one of the better teams in the league. Again, right now, they are pretty clearly a Worlds team in my eyes, so long as they don't screw it up, and if Lucid continues to get even better than this, if he can become kind of a takeover jungler in terms of his ability to carry games, like what was, kind of thought of in terms of his playstyle when he was coming up from the Challengers League, then I think DK could really be a scary team, like a potential finals team if everything were to go right. Obviously, they're a long way from that, but we're talking about, a couple months into the future here, and, at least that being on the table, I think is a pretty big upgrade from spring. And then moving on to our second series here of day number 2, and it's a battle between the two winless teams here in the LCK. It's KT Rolster taking on OK BRION, and finally, KT Rolster is able to pick up their first win here of the summer split. Long overdue. They've had a really tough schedule. I'm not going to try and sit here and pretend that, that schedule is everything, but they have had the hardest schedule in the LCK by a pretty considerable margin, and they've started 0-4. Because of it, they've exclusively played upper echelon teams. They've run into some issues. Perfect was obviously sick in week number 1. Beryl is sick right now. He was clearly playing through it. He did not look good on stage. Like, he looked fine in the game, but, the guy looked like he was sick on stage, and so there's a lot going on with KT Rolster right now, but at the very least, they are able to pick up their first win here against the laughingstock of the LCK in Bro, who's just, they're horrible. They're horrible in every aspect. This is just a really bad team. There's really nothing else to say in that regard, but they still dropped a game. They still dropped game 2. I get it. Game 3 looked really good, and they really dominated them. It was not close, but I would have preferred it be a 2-0. I certainly would have preferred KT looking like their dominant selves once again, but it didn't really come through on that. We'll talk about it, though, because there are positives to take away. Player of the series for me is going to go to Deft in the bot lane for KT. He was really their best player, I would say, through most of spring. I think when you're looking at the whole split, Pioshik was definitely the most important player towards their team, as I've talked about on multiple occasions on this channel. When Pioshik plays well, this team typically wins. When he loses, this team typically loses. It is a bit of a binary cycle when it comes to KT Rolster, but Deft, I would say, overall was their most constructive player, definitely the one that was the one you could play off of the most, the one that was creating the most amount of tempo for the team, and that very much carried over here. I know Pioshik and even Perfect are going to get a little bit more of the spotlight in terms of the games that they played in this series, but I thought Deft was unbelievably good. He was super good in game 1 and was pretty stable throughout the rest of the series. Games 2 and 3 were good. The Ezreal was really solid. Obviously, the Caitlyn's good. He's got a world skin of her. He obviously knows how to play Caitlyn. It's kind of his signature champion, and so, to see Deft come out and kind of just be the rock for this team, I think is good. One of the things I was most concerned about is that Deft, over the course of last split, really adopted kind of the KTRX mentality that he didn't really have when he was actually on DRX, when they won Worlds. He was kind of the stable, non-exciting player on DRX in terms of the performances that he would give. Of course, narratively, he was very exciting, but he was, the one that was trying to not die in a lot of the circumstances. He was not flipping the game. He was doing that for KT last split. The aggressive tendencies that he kind of learned on DK last year very much translated here, and sometimes it was a little bit too much to pair that up with someone like Pioshik and someone like Beryl, who were already going to be having those super aggressive tendencies. It seems that he has pulled back on that a little bit. Moving into the summer split, I expect there to still be more aggression than there was on DRX in terms of, the way he wants to play out the early game. He wants to be a bit more of a resource carry now, but for the most part, I think it's more justifiable in terms of where the team is at the current moment. I do want to give a shout out to Topside. Pioshik and Perfect were both really good. Pioshik, when he wins, he looks really good, as we saw on the Viego here in the back half of the series. Youngjae actually kind of at his number in game number 2. Youngjae was unbelievably good on the Taliyah in that second game. He just couldn't really carry that over and got completely outplayed in that third game, and Pioshik is definitely the player to give that kind of commendation to. But Perfect was also very solid. I'm really starting to believe in Perfect as a really solid top laner at this level. He has just been good. I'm not going to say he's been great. He is, dare I say, not been perfect, but he has been very, very solid, and I think especially on a team that is really looking for anybody to find any semblance of consistency on a game-to-game basis, I think it's nice to have a player in Perfect who does have the ability to win basically any matchup. You can put him in negative matchups, you can put him on the Skarner, you can, really ask him to do whatever you need him to do, and he's still going to be very useful in that circumstance. He can play tanks, he can play carries, just a bit of everything, weak side, strong side. He's just a very versatile player. Might not be, the best in the league mechanically, but he is certainly someone that is starting to show that that consistency that I really valued from him at lower levels. I was really high on Perfect. He was actually my pick at the beginning of the year for Rookie of the Year. That's not something that's really worked out, but we will continue to monitor and see how his development ends up going. I don't think it's out of the realm of possibility for him to be in the conversation. BDD and Barrel were also fine. BDD had a generally fine series. He was definitely better towards the back half. Once Pulbay came in game number 3, like he obliterated Pulbay in that third game. And then Barrel was fine. Again, didn't really have to do a whole ton. His aggressive tendencies were mostly backed up by the rest of the team. And it was clear that he was, affected by whatever illness he's going through right now. I would have benched him. Like, he does not look healthy. And if he wants to play, great, but it doesn't look like he's doing all that well. And so I was very surprised to see him on stage. But, if that's going to be the case, as long as he's playing fine, then I'm not going to criticize it too much. This is a win for KT Rolster, and man, did they need that desperately. And then for Bro on the other side, it's just everything going wrong. Like, this is the worst team in the LCK, and it's not really particularly close. Like, Nongshim is bad, but at least they have Jiwoo. Like, Bro doesn't have anything. Youngjae is kind of interesting. He had a really good second game on the Talia. He did a really good job of, trying to integrate Pulbay when he was, brought into the lineup in game number 2, but it just completely fell apart after that. Game 3 was an utter demolition for the side of KT. Bro got absolutely massacred in that, and everyone played bad. Dud of the series for me is actually going to go to Pulbay because of just how bad he was on the Yone in that third and final game. I don't know what direction you want to go here. Karis has proven that he's really not an LCK caliber mid laner, but Pulbay didn't come in and really light me on fire or anything like that. Maybe if you give him more time to scrim with the first team, give him some more stage opportunities, perhaps he could be a bit better. He was okay on the Corki in game number 2, which is more than I can say for Karis throughout most of the games that he has spent in the LCK, so I'm not going to jump to conclusions. I'm not going to try to overestimate here, but it's definitely going to be interesting to monitor if they make a change in the mid lane. Pulbay, though, unfortunately, because of how bad he was in that third game going up against BDD's Ari, like, he has to get done of the series. He was simply horrible there. Youngjae is the only other player who had a game nearly as bad in game number 3 on the Talia, but he basically single-handedly won the second game, and so I did want to cut him a bit of slack in terms of, giving him dud of the series. I think Envy and Polu also continue to be pretty clearly the worst bot lane in the LCK. Polu is just awful. He was actually better in this series than he has been in quite a while. The Nautilus at least was okay in game number 2, which I think is better than basically anything he's done so far in 2024, but Envy actually had a horrible series here. The Kaisa was brutal in game number 3, unplayable bad. Like, he was just significantly worse than Deft in every single conceivable way. Morgan was generally whatever on the top side, which I guess is better than what he was last week where he was horrible, so I don't really know. Bro is just awful. Like, every negative thing that I said about them all year long, put it all here. Like, it's not good and it's not getting better. And then KT is, fine. I think I'm not going to panic about them. I don't know if this is going to be a team that competes for a world spot. I've moved them down to number 6, but they should be a playoff team, even with all the problems that they currently have. They can beat anybody on any given day. We saw that last split, and this is always going to be a rather streaky team. I think this could be a win that hopefully starts to ignite something in them. I just need to see it before I really believe it. Then moving on now to our middle day here in week number 3. It's day number 3, and we kick it off with a matchup between FearX and the Kwangdong Freecs. The KDF is going to pick up the win, and again, not an upset, not a surprise. KDF has very much cemented themselves in the upper echelon of teams, the upper half of teams in the LCK. Bottom 4 feels more established right now than ever. DRX really being the only team in the bottom 4 that's shown any life, and even then, they are questionable at best. KDF has really usurped that lower half reputation that they had in the spring split. They are a significantly better team now than they were in spring, and I do think that obviously bringing someone like Leaper in helps with that, but I think just general upgrades and, consistency around the rest of the roster has been more impactful, at least directly impactful in terms of what I've seen on the Rift, and the positives that this team has always had. The reason that I was so excited about what the roster could do in the offseason when we were talking about them in December and in January of this past year is this top side of the map. They are coming to fruition right now, and I'm really excited to say that. Player of the series is going to go to Dudu on the top side of the map, in the top lane here. 2 games of Cassante, and he dominated. I mean, there are times where this guy plays exactly like Keen. Like, it's actually ridiculous how underrated he is on a global scale. I've been saying it for a while at this point. I think you can consider him a channel darling. I think it would be pretty ridiculous to not do so. He's a player I've just been high on for a very long time. I praised him a lot on Hanwha Life in 2022, and then obviously I was super in on him last year. I thought he was an all-pro caliber top laner, like legit a top 3 top laner in the LCK for basically the entirety of 2023. He wasn't quite as standoutish in 2024 spring. I attribute a lot of that to the fact that he just had a diminished role. He was playing weak side a lot more, but the skill set is definitely still there for him to be a legit difference maker on the top side of the map, akin to like a Keen or a Zeus for, KDF. Maybe he's never going to be what those two players are. Like, I don't know if he's ever going to be as good as those two, but he certainly can be as good as someone like Doran on Hanwha Life. Like, he can be the third best top laner in the LCK, and I think he can get there pretty cleanly, and he dominated this series. Clear is obviously not the worst competition to run into when you're trying to, dominate. He is a player that has really struggled to really capture a lot of consistency at this level, but Dudu still, he's been able to beat players better than Clear, and the fact that he's able to come out here and dominate on K'Sante in a situation like this, it's just very encouraging. It's really nice to see him play well. And Cuz is in a similar boat. Cuz had a very good series here. It's funny because the narrative for a long time was that Cuz can't play Nidalee, and so it's really funny to see him come out in these two games and just play Nidalee really well, especially game number 1, where he quite frankly dominated on that champion, just completely ran circles around Raptor in terms of what he was able to do. But these were the players I was excited about, or most excited about, at least going into the year for KDF. When you think back to those preseason rankings, both of these were top 4 players in their positions in my mind, and, if KDF, like I said, wanted to be a top 6 team, it was likely going to come from the top side of the map. That seems to be what's happening right now. I'm not trying to diminish the efforts of the rest of this team, and the bot lane is definitely better right now than it has been at any point this year, but their stars, their carries are the top side of the map. They're the best players on the team, and they're stepping up right now. Leaper and Ondil have still been very good. They've definitely been an upgrade. Bull was fine for this team, but I think anybody would have looked like a good player when you're replacing Taiyun in the bot lane, and so, Bull coming in was generally good. He definitely trailed off as the split went along in spring, but Leaper is really just, impressed me in terms of his raw mechanics. The guy is clearly ridiculously talented, and if he's going to be able to keep up this kind of momentum for the rest of the split, KDF really might have found something here in a player that just basically has no pro experience. He has been phenomenal for them, and Ondil has done a really good job supporting him. Ondil is one of those, I don't want to say fair weather supports. He reminds me so much of Ignar in terms of his playstyle. If you are, a fan of the LCS and the LEC, I think Ignar is a very valid comparison for Ondil as a support, where when he's looking good, he looks really good, and, he's really good at making the rest of his teammates be solid when they're winning, but when the team is losing, he often looks really bad, and he can take the brunt of the bad decisions in terms of being overextended and in terms of just not being on the same page as everybody else. I think that that's kind of the case for Ondil here on KDF, and lucky for him, the team is in a good state right now, and he's looking good because of it. So the bot lane looking better, topside looking good. KDF is just kind of rolling right now, and I'm really happy to say that. And for Fox on the other side, this team is really just not good. It's a bit disappointing how not good they are. I think there's a couple of players that I had hopes for that really have not been able to, I guess, make the most of those expectations. Execute is obviously the first one that comes to mind. To me, he has clearly been the worst player on this team this split. I know a lot of people are going to shout at Raptor, but Execute continues to be really bad. Raptor is going to get my dud of the series here, but at least Raptor was good in week 1. He was really bad in weeks 2 and 3, and you've got Willer down in the Challengers League, and obviously that decision was heavily criticized in the offseason. It's even more criticizable now that Willer is down in the Challengers League, absolutely dominating. He might win MVP of the Challengers League because he's simply too good to be down there. It just raises more questions on why Raptor was brought in the first place if he's this upside player when this team really needs to kind of find wins anywhere that they can get them. They benched their best player, and it's kind of crazy. And then you look at a series like this where Raptor has to go up against an actual good jungler in Cuz, and he looks horrible. The Maokai in particular was miserable in game number 1. He is just not adept at playing that champion. The Viego was slightly better in the second game, but Cuz was definitely more active and, controlled the entire map on the Nidalee. The Raptor was really horrible in this series, and he has to be better. Again, there's been upside games for Raptor. He's not looked horrible in every game, quite like Execute has, in my opinion, but if you're fighting over which one of your players has been more underwhelming, that's a really bad place to be for a team in Fox. I do think there are some upsides. Henna has honestly been, shockingly good over the course of this split. Henna is a player that I've always never really felt all that strongly about, but I think he's proving that he's generally fine, only a slightly below average AD carry at this level. Maybe not somebody who is ever going to be all that relevant, but, someone who could probably survive. He's playing fine, generally speaking. He just doesn't really have a lot of support. Closer, I think, was fine before this series. He got completely completely destroyed in this series, didn't really get to do anything, but he's not really been the issue, and Clear is certainly not the answer in the top lane, but I think Raptor and Execute are certainly the bigger problems right now, and if your problems are jungle support, your macro game's probably pretty out of whack, and that's the case for Fox. But for KDF, this is genuinely one of the scarier teams in the LCK right now. I don't think this is going to be a Worlds team. You know, I have them ranked number 5. That's just outside the World spots in terms of my power rankings. I really haven't seen anything to dissuade that idea. Their schedule has been pretty friendly up until this point, and I would expect things to get a little bit more difficult for them when they start playing some of the other teams that are competing for those upper echelon spots. But if you see any sort of movement, like if Hanwha Life continues to struggle, if DK ends up kind of reverting to what they were in spring, if, you know, this sudden outburst of theirs isn't realistic, like KDF is going to be the team that ends up pouncing on one of those top 4 spots. And so just keeping themselves in the conversation is way more than I think we ever expected out of this team. And then moving on to our second series of day number 3 here, and it's certainly not a shocking outcome. It's Gen.G taking on DRX, and Gen.G is going to pick up the 2-0. That's 6-0, that's 12-0 to start this split for Gen.G, and they did it again. They destroyed them again. A 20-minute game in game number 1. An absolute destruction of DRX, who looked horrible across this week, I might add. A very difficult week for DRX in terms of opponents. T1 and Gen.G certainly don't make things easy, but they did not look good in any of their 4 games. They got absolutely destroyed in 3 of them. I think 2 of them were sub 22 minutes, which is disaster. Like, it wasn't a very good week for DRX, but for Gen.G, it's exactly, I mean, it's exactly what we thought they'd be. They are exactly who we thought they were. Like, insert the meme here because it's just the truth. I'm gonna say all the things that I've already said about this team. This segment might not actually be that long because there really isn't a lot to say that I haven't already said. Player of the series is going to go to Canyon. He's the best Nidalee in the world. I mean, do you need me to tell you that? You already knew that. It's not like his Karthus was significantly worse. He was doing the most damage in the game by a ginormous margin. Now that basically always happens with Karthus, but this time it wasn't at the expense of pressure in terms of what his team was able to do in the mid game because everybody else on the team was already winning their 1v1s or their 2v2s. And so the Karthus just kind of got to farm up, and you hit a late game with Karthus, Cassante, Zeri, Corki, it's over. Like, there's no way to play that in game number 2. The only reason that went 30 minutes is because their comp necessitated it went 30 minutes. They thoroughly outplayed DRX even in the second game, and Canyon continues to just be dominant. He is, I would assume, everybody's leader for MVP right now in the LCK. He has been that good. He has been that dominant. It is a meta that is meant to make carry junglers shine, and Canyon's living up to that at the current moment. It wasn't just him, though. I mean, Chovy continues to be the best Corki in the world, and it's not particularly close. I blamed him for a lot of the spring split because I said for a lot of spring that Corki was a super overvalued champion, that the champ was just a damage number and not really all that useful in terms of what he actually accomplished on the Rift. He, you know, made Graph go burr at the end of the game, and that was basically it, but people kept picking him because Chovy would pick him and dominate games on him, actively carry. And I was like, Chovy's got to stop playing him, stop trying to convince everybody else in the world that this is a genuinely good champ. Well, he's doing it again. He's just so far and away the best Corki in the world. It's not even really fair to try and watch him play against anybody else. And, you know, it is what it is. Pays is having a phenomenal split. This is super reminiscent of a summer split from last year, except he's receiving less resources and being just as useful. I think that this is character development. This is growth from Pays. Lahenz has been really good. Keen was really good. I mean, Cassante's ridiculous, but he obliterated Rascal in game number 1 on the Kennen. We will get to Rascal, do not worry. But, I mean, Gen.G's unstoppable. What do you want me to say? DRX didn't look good, but it's against Gen.G and T1 this week, so really, like, how much can I criticize them? Well, there is one thing I can criticize them for, and that's continuously playing Rascal in the top lane. What are we doing? Like, what else does he need to show you guys? He's been benched. You put him back in for the final game of that series against T1. He didn't do anything. He was 0-0-0. Completely irrelevant throughout the game overall. And now you put him back in here against Gen.G, and yes, I get it, it's Keen, but Rascal is once again the worst player in the world. Like, that's definitely a hyperbolic statement. I'm not trying to sit here and say he definitely is the worst player in the world, but can you name me a game from anybody in any region that was worse than his game 1 on Malphite? Like, truly unplayable. Like, unplayably bad. He is done of the series, and he can't play right now. You cannot play Rascal. I don't know what it is. You know, anybody who's followed the channel knows that I've been a Rascal fan in the past. In fact, I was a huge Rascal defender in 2021 and in 2022 in particular on this channel. There were times on KT Rolster where I was calling him the best top laner in the world. But ever since he's joined DRX, he has exploded. He has stopped being able to play the game. And I think the difference between me and at least parts of the community is that I'm willing to change my opinion. I'm willing to sit here and go, yeah, there were times where I thought he was ridiculously good, but it's just not the person he is anymore. I'm not going to hang on to who he was because who he is right now is not good enough. I get it that Frog is really bad in lane, and maybe Frog is just as bad in a series like this. Maybe you're scared about Frog having to go one-on-one with Keem in the top lane, but at the very least, Frog gives you something in team fights. Rascal is just a complete zero. Like, he is absolutely nothing for this team. On the Skarner, on the Malphite, it doesn't matter. He offers you nothing right now in terms of what he is giving you, and that's been that case for a year and a half. Like, the sample size is way too big at this point to say anything other than he needs to go do something else. He needs to go to the Challengers League, or he needs to go to a different team or a different org, something, because what is happening right now is just simply not good enough. Also, this was pretty standard for DRX in the fact that Playta is ridiculously good. What a crazy series from him. He actually really showed up here and played really well. Again, probably my biggest channel darling right now is Playta, who I think, you know, I've said multiple times on this channel, I think he's going to be a star in the support position. I think he could be Delight in terms of plays for a bad team, gets picked up by one good team once, and all of a sudden becomes one of the best supports in the world. And he really dominated here. Teddy was okay. Like, he didn't make any major errors. That's the Teddy thing. He didn't capitalize maybe as much as you would want, but Playta was the real star here for DRX. It's really hard for me not to watch these games and see that. Yehu was generally fine. He was probably better here than he was in their first series against T1, and Sponge continues to have no pressure, but it's Canyon. How much can I blame him? Overall, DRX is, you know, interesting. Like, they at least have pieces. Like, Playta's really good. I think Yehu in the right circumstance could be fine. Teddy is a player that can win games so long as you give him opportunities, but if topside's going to be this bad, if you're going to play Rascal, like, call it doomed. Like, if DRX will be in the bottom three, and it just will be what it is. And then for Gen.G on the other side, I mean, what do you want me to say? Like, this is the best team in the world. I've already said it 100 times. You don't need me to say it again. Like, who is stopping them? And then moving on now to day number 4, and man, am I excited to kick off the conversation on day 4. It's the telecom war. It's T1 taking on KT Rolster. And of course KT Rolster won this. I mean, who is really all that surprised? I mean, truly, is this upset shocking to anyone? T1 has looked a little bit shaky, but, you know, generally speaking, they've been untouchable outside of Gen.G. They were 8-3 going into this performance. It's not like they've really underperformed at any point up until this, you know, series. And then KT Rolster has been nothing but underperformances. They've been nothing but a disappointment across this split, but they already won earlier on in the week. They got gifted that win by OK BRION. Remember, this team can't go 1-1. They are allergic to going 1-1. They already won their first series. That means they have to win the second one, no matter who they are going up against. And unfortunately for T1, that happened to be them. It was a very fun atmosphere. You know, T1 really decked it out with a lot of the flair for a series of this caliber, and KT lived up to that. There are a couple of players that are so clutch on KT Rolster, and clutch, I'm saying almost as like a double-edged sword, almost derogatory term, because they are so good in the big moments and so bad when they just do not give a shit, and it's really funny to watch. But when they care, man, they can play some really good games, and there is nobody who embodies that more than Pioshik in the jungle, who's gonna get my player of the series here for KT. The difference between Pioshik when he is like trying and when he's winning and getting to play from ahead and actively being aggressive versus Pioshik when he's just kind of coasting and, you know, really kind of relying on his teammates, it's night and day. It is very, very funny to watch. And, you know, I guess you can call Pioshik a super clutch player. I think that technically applies. I think it's almost against the spirit of the term to call him that, because he's not clutch in the sense that he is, you know, unbelievably good in these really tense moments, rather that those are the only moments he really ever shows up in. But, you know, it's an okay thing to have. I would rather you show up in important moments than non-important moments, so long as you can get to the important moments. And Pioshik did a really good job in this series. The Viego in game number 3 just completely took over. He ran that game. When he's able to get going, when he's able to team fight front to back at the end of games, like, that's really where his sweet spot is individually as a jungler, is when he can play stuff like Viego or even Lee Sin to a smaller extent and be able to kind of manipulate front to back 5v5s. That's really where he feels most comfortable. We definitely saw that the most in North America, but, you know, he's always kind of been a player like that, and so to see him pick Viego and really dominate on it, you know, it's important. But the player I really want to talk about And the player that I think I'm really starting to get like an itch for in terms of really liking watching him play is Perfect in the top lane. I was already really high on Perfect going into this year. You know, I ranked him really highly in terms of my preseason rankings because I loved his Challengers League tape. I went out on a record and said, like, purely off of tape alone, I actually thought Perfect looked better than Thanatos in the Challengers League when you're specifically looking at how they individually impacted their own teams. I thought Perfect was the most valuable top laner in the Challengers League, and so I was really excited to see what he could do, and this org obviously had a lot of trust and confidence to promote him up with what is ostensibly a super team around him, or at least a team full of veterans around him, and he has paid that out. He has been a positive for this team overall, but one thing that you have to say about Perfect, this dude is clutch, and he's not clutch in the Pioshik way where he doesn't show up in big moments. He's clutch in like a clutch way where he's just really good at the end of games when you need one guy to hit a game-winning ultimate. Like, Perfect is about as good at that as anybody else in the world. Like, he is always in the right position at the end of games. He's a phenomenal team fighter, and really it does separate him. I think he's a good enough laner to, like, really make a difference at this level, and if he can be, like, one of the better team fighting top laners in the world, he could be a really scary player to have to run into. I'm not going to say that he can be a player like Bin, but he kind of could be a player like Bin if everything were to work out. That clutch factor is just super real. Like, he played a lot of weird moves on that Skarner, but he hit the most important ultimate in the game in that final team fight. And then the Rumble, like, really, I mean, I'm praising him for the Rumble game in game number 2, which was terrific. I mean, he won lane in game number 2 and translated that into dominating the rest of the map. He is just a really intriguing player to watch. He's not a finished product, but he's someone I really want to keep my eye on. BDD is also playing much better right now. I still don't think he's like a star in the same way that you would hope he would be. He's not in that same conversation as players like Faker and Chovy and Showmaker for me. He's not like in that upper echelon, at least in terms of the performances I've seen most recently, but he is certainly playing significantly better than he did at the beginning of the split. And Deft and Barrel were good in this series as well. Overall, KT is going to be happy with this win, especially because topside is looking pretty solid. And then for T1, obviously you're disappointed in this, but are you really even all that surprised? I mean, Barrel is sick. You know, KT was going into enemy territory and they've been on a losing streak. Of course they ended up winning this. I'm not going to freak out if I'm T1. They've lost series here and there before. You know, KT is known to do the odd upset every once in a while, as Gen.G is very aware of, but I would like to, you know, talk about a couple of things that I think this team could have done better. KIA is going to get done of the series. I've been a little bit underwhelmed with KIA over the course of this year, not because he's been bad, but just because he's not been perfect. Like, again, it's almost similar to how I talk about Ruler over in the LPL. Ruler's been playing a lot better in the summer split, but how I talked about him in spring was like, yeah, he's like a borderline all-pro caliber guy, but that alone is kind of a disappointment for the expectations that we had for him as a player. It's kind of the same thing for KIA, where he's kind of been a borderline all-pro caliber support. He's been good and definitely a positive for the team, but not as much as he's been in the past, and that alone with the expectations he has is kind of a disappointment, so it's just an interesting situation. There was some weird engages in this series, and he felt a little off-kilter. I think T1 in general has been playing from behind more than they did last year, and I think they're not quite as comfortable in that zone. They're still pretty good at playing in that zone, but they're not quite as comfortable as they would be playing from ahead. So something I'm expecting this team to clean up, because they always clean things up as the year goes along. But I also want to point out Zeus. He was really good in game 1 on the Skarner, but games 2 and 3, he like completely disappeared. He got destroyed in game number 2. He was nowhere in game number 3 on the Cassante. He's always been a streaky player, a bit feast or famine. When he loses hard. He relies on winning picks, counter picks on the top lane more than a lot of other elite top laners in the world. And, you know, we're kind of seeing the folly of that where, you know, if he gets in these more neutral matchups, he's not always as dominant as other players, and Perfect was definitely better than him down the stretch of this series. Again, it's just something to monitor. Owner, Faker, and Guma were generally fine, even if Owner could have been a bit better on the Zyra in game number 3. I'm not going to freak out or panic about T1. They're still probably the second best team in the LCK, but it's nice to see that KT can still pull off their magic. Now, it's not really about winning the series. It's about what you do after this. You know, 2-0 is all well and good, but if you go 0-2 again next week and just completely throw away all that momentum, then what was it for at the end of the day? So it's really, you know, great that KT was able to pick up this win, but if they can't transition it to future success, then it really ends up meaning nothing. And then moving on to our second series here of day number 4, and it's another one that went pretty predictably. Nongshim RedForce taking on Hanwha Life Esports, and HLE is going to pick up the 2-0 win, as they should here. They moved to 4-2, but a lot of their hard games are out of the way. They have played a lot of the teams that are going to be the most difficult for them. Not all of the teams that are going to be the most difficult for them. They've still got a couple left in the first round robin here, but now they're starting to get to take care of business against teams that are a little bit, considerably, I'll say, weaker than they are in terms of actual actual skill, and I think it's been really fun to watch. Player of the series is going to go to Peanut, who has quietly been on like an absolute tear over the last few games. Like week 2 was Peanut's week. He was player of the week for the league as a whole, and I don't even think that was really all that disputable. He absolutely dominated week number 2, and week number 3, like they went up against Gen.G, and Peanut looked really good, was doing his absolute best to win those games. He was the best player on HLE in that series, and then he comes back out here and just dominates Nongshim. He plays Vi and Sejuani and is able to control the map and really shut down everything that Nongshim want to do. Like, he is just playing amazing right now, and I understand there is a contingent of people that will, hate on Peanut, and I can understand it. Not every player is going to be super flashy. Generally speaking, this feels like a bit of a controversial statement. We'll see how this goes over. I think generally the League of Legends esports fan base is super disrespectful to non-carry junglers, to facilitation junglers. Players like Peanut, players like Tarzan, players like Karsa, that kind of fit into that mold of, wanting to help out their teammates and are really, strong in the macro mid-game section of the game and maybe aren't quite as dominant team fighters. I think that area of the game is maybe a little bit undervalued by fans as a whole because they're not flashy, but as you know, if you watch my channel, I value those players very highly. I've always valued Peanut very highly. Multiple times throughout the last couple of years, I've called him the best jungler in the world, including going into this year. That's not really lived up because Canyon and Kanavi have been so good, but like he's still probably top 3. He's at least in the conversation for top 3. He's right there with players like Owner and Shun and Tian that I think are also in the conversation, but I would probably take Peanut over those players, and so it's really cool to see him just play great right now. It's been 2 straight weeks of just him destroying games, like playing like an MVP level, player. And it's really funny. I know jungle is kind of the position right now that looks really strong in the meta, but with Peanut kind of taking more of those aggressive chances, and I think understanding that he has to take matters into his own hands a bit more on HLE than he did on Gen.G, he's actually performed a bit better. The rest of this team was still very good. Doran dominated the top lane matchup. Doran was really good in this series. Doran haters were nowhere to be found in terms of this series. We'll talk about Mihail in a second. But Viper and Delight looked significantly better. Delight actually had a pretty phenomenal series overall. The Gen.G boys that joined HLE were definitely the stars here, but Viper also very good. Zeka still very good. He really has not had a bad game yet this split, even with the team not really focused around him in terms of how they wanted to play the game. Overall, HLE did what they were supposed to do, and Peanut, in particular, is looking incredible right now. And then for Nongshim on the other side of this matchup, we'll talk about the substitution first. Dindin is out, Mihail is in. I don't know if this is a long-term kind of decision or if this was just kind of a test run against HLE. We've seen teams do this in the past. Nongshim very famously was, caught in between just switching players out basically randomly at the beginning of the year, whether it was mid lane, whether it was top lane. Like, they just couldn't figure out a group of 5 that they actually wanted to start. It seems like Mihail at least was going to come in for this series. He's going to get dead of the series. He was not very good. Doran really abused him in terms of the 1v1, but I see a lot of people being like, well, why would you bench Dindin? And I just don't get it, man. I don't get the Dindin hype. Like, is it all based off of reputation? Because it certainly is not based off of gameplay. Like, he has hype plays, like in the same way that other players that, are over, rated in the top lane kind of have hype plays, but he doesn't have the same kind of hype plays as someone like Mirwin over in the LEC, who also probably gets propped up above his skill level. Like, he's just kind of a below average top laner in every aspect. I don't really understand what people see in Dindin to continuously rate him. Is it just like, oh, Dindin was supposed to be good, and so we're going to assume that he can become good, or is it because he's been on a bad team? Like, I don't really know. Dindin has been the worst top laner in the LCK for essentially a year now, and, Mihail coming in at least shakes that up a little bit. It doesn't seem like Mihail's going to be a ton better. He was really bad in this series, but I'm not against this team going in a different direction in the top lane. Certainly not. But they might have to go in a different direction in a couple of other lanes as well. Guger was horrible this week. He has really just not been good enough. Again, it really is questionable why they went with him as a starting support. I really don't have an answer to that. Hopefully someday we get an answer on that. Fisher has completely regressed back to what he was in the LPL in spring. Again, he showed some interesting things in terms of his laning ability at the beginning of this split, but it has not been able to stick really at all. He was awful in this series. Overall, Nongshim is still bad. Do not get it twisted. I understand this team had a weird win earlier on last week against DRX, but that's not something that I'm expecting to be very consistent or something replicable for this team. They need to capitalize on the other team somehow being worse than they are. They are not going to outskill anybody, and for HLE, they're just too talented, and Peanut is playing truly out of his mind right now. He had a rough week number 1, but ever since then, he has been essentially perfect for this team, and if he continues to play like this, he's going to be right up there with Canyon in terms of an MVP favorite for the league as a whole. That's really where he's playing right now, so I'm excited to be able to see that, and I hope HLE is starting to find their level of consistency. But that's going to bring us to our final day of action, day number 5 here in week number 3, and we kicked off day 5 with a bottom of the table matchup between FearX and OK BRION. That Fear is going to pick up a win in. This is expected. We thought that Bro would go to 0-6. I think me and everyone always just kind of assumed that this was going to be by far the worst team in the LCK. Somehow it's become even better of a take that I was so critical of Bro in the offseason. You know, I kind of got pushback for how negative I was about their offseason in the sense that I don't think a lot of people thought they were going to be good, but rather they thought I was too harsh in terms of my criticisms of, oh, they're just a small org with no money that can't go out and get players. Well, you're right, they are a small market org in comparison to T1 and Gen.G and even middle-tier organizations like DRX or the Kwangdong Freecs, right? Like, Bro's not going to be able to compete monetarily with those orgs, or at least presumably they're not going to be able to, but they put in no effort. Like, they actively went out and got bad players, and that really is, like, horrible. They had the worst offseason of any team in the entire world. I said that in January, and that's translated, I think, to their performance on the Rift. And now, as I've said multiple times throughout this split, I'm not even sure they would be, like, top 8 in North America. Like, I don't know if this team beats Rogue over in the LEC. Like, they are that bad. They have nothing going for them. This team truly is just horrendous. They have a couple of players who are individually interesting, but the overall package that they offer is just so garbage. And Fox, while they have their own problems and they clearly are struggling in their own way, they're certainly better than whatever is going on Bro. So, you know, good for them for being able to pick up this win, but I don't think it's like a super big confidence booster to beat Bro itself. Player of the series is going to go to Raptor in the jungle. He's gotten both of the player of the series for FearX's wins over the course of this split. I think some people forget that. I know people really want Raptor to not be good because they like Willer, and it was pretty ridiculous that Willer got benched, but Raptor is actually probably the most influential player on this team in terms of how they have ended up playing at the beginning part of this split. Raptor really is like baby Willer, like in terms of how he ends up playing the game. I don't think he's quite as mechanically talented, but he is a very similar style of player. I think he's a bit of a Xin Zhao merchant, which we're starting to see at the beginning of this split, but Raptor can win games for your team when he's going up against a team that doesn't really know how to respond in the early game and kind of folds under the pressure of a lot of very quick skirmishes. I think Raptor can really work in that regard, but he's just going to be naturally inconsistent because the more he goes up against better junglers, the worse he is going to perform. It's really not an ideal situation to have. Again, I think Willer would be better, but I think Raptor is somehow the most interesting player on this team in terms of their ability to actually win games right now. Clear also was relatively good here. Man, Morgan's fallen off. Like, I don't really know what to tell you at this point. Like, Morgan was actually really good for this team in spring, and, you know, he's been very good over the past couple of years. He's kind of found a nice niche on this team as this weird cult option for a lot of fans. Lord Morgan, obviously, but this is easily his worst split so far on Bro. He has genuinely been one of the worst top laners in the league in terms of 1v1ing. When Clear is bodying you in the 1v1, that's a really bad sign. Like, that is not something that I would expect to happen. 2 games of Skarner, and he was useless in both. It's really not ideal. Also, I didn't really point it out, but Execute was benched here. Duro came in and started in the support position. I believe that's how you say his name, and he was better. Maybe it's because you're playing Bro and Envy and Polu have been a disaster. Polu has clearly been the worst support, maybe the worst player in the LCK over the course of this split, but yeah, keep going with Duro. Like, Execute was not working on this team. He was not playing well. He did not feel comfortable playing with Henna. Whatever the problem was, like, if the solution is going to be moving to a different support, if you can stabilize at least a little bit in the bot lane, that's going to be good, because Henna, like I said earlier, has really not been all that bad this split. He's probably been the most consistent player on Fox, and that's a pretty interesting thing to say overall. He was fine here against his former Oregon. Closer had a pretty decent series. Karis was generally fine on the other side of this matchup as well, but, you know, Fox was better across the board. Raptor and Clear, definitely the standouts. Even someone like Duro was a bit of a standout for me in a positive way. It's all well and good to beat Bro, but it doesn't really fill me with a ton of confidence that you've, like, completely changed the outlook of this team. And then for Bro on the other side, this team is just awful. Like, I've already honestly gone over most of it. This is the worst team in the LCK. It's one of the worst teams in the world, specifically of a tier 1 region. There just isn't really a lot to look at and like in terms of this team. Youngjae sometimes does something interesting. You know, you're hoping Morgan can come back and be something for this team, but, like, those are the positives. That's literally where it ends, and those positives aren't even all that strong. Dead of the series is going to go to Envy, who was horrible in this series on the Ezreal, on the Xayah. It didn't really matter. Envy is playing, like, LGD Envy right now. He's not playing like Sandbox Envy, and even then, Sandbox Envy was already kind of bad. Like, Envy's just not a good player. I was so critical of them going out and being like, our big offseason acquisition is Envy, because Envy's not an LCK caliber 80 carry. If he's your addition, if he's your big new player this offseason, that's ridiculous. And even if jungle has been interesting as a position for them over the course of this year, whether it be Gideon or Youngjae here, I like Youngjae more, and, Karis was okay in this series. He's not been as much of a disaster so far in summer as he was in spring. Polu is a nightmare, and Effort was even worse. Morgan has really regressed, and it's not like those players are actually doing good things for you. Bro is just so clearly the worst team in the LCK, and I don't really see any reason for it to ever get better for them. They are just a disaster, and they were expected to be a disaster, but at least FearX picks up their second win of the split. They're going to be what they were last split, which is merchants of the bottom half of the standings. They're probably going to finish somewhere around 8th or maybe 7th if another team ends up really underperforming again, but this is not going to be a team that gets anywhere near competing for a playoff berth. Like, they have so many issues of their own. And that's going to bring us to our final series of the week here in the LCK. And our final series was a good one, a pair of 4-1 teams. The Kwangdong Freecs taking on Dplus KIA. And DK is going to pick up the 2-1 series win. They're going to move to 5-1 and really solidify themselves at the top of the standings. For KDF, obviously, it's a bit disappointing that you walk away with a loss in this series, but you looked pretty decent, or at least players on your team looked pretty decent. I think some of the drafts could definitely use some work, but overall, I don't think this is the worst loss in the world for them. They went toe-to-toe, they won a game off of Dplus KIA. They were able to win a very close, hotly contested game number 1, and, even if games 2 and 3 weren't all that close, and even if there definitely are areas that are concerning if you are trying to qualify for Worlds, there are still positives to take away from a series like this. But at the end of the day, DK is just a really freaking good League of Legends team right now. They are so much better than they were in spring. This team has evolved and improved so much over the last couple of months, and I'm really excited to be able to say that. Last split, in spring, really throughout the entirety of 2024 up until this point, it really was like Showmaker versus the world. Aiming and Kellen were generally fine, and Kingen would survive most of the time on the top side, but Lucid was definitely not consistent, and there would be games where Kellen would run it. There would be games where Kingen would run it, and you just wouldn't always have these perfect situations, and Showmaker really had to do a lot of the heavy lifting. I think now, with a more well-rounded, a more varied team, things are just easier on everybody involved, and when you get performances out of the top side of the map like you did in this series, man, it becomes a lot easier to win. Kingen is a super easy choice for player of the series in the top lane. This might be the best Renekton game of the year. I mean, he obliterated KDF on that Renekton. Not only did he dominate lane, but he used that pressure to move around the map and really just end the game super quickly in the mid game. When he was in a fight, it was over because he was always in the right spot. He was dealing infinite damage. He was never killable in any of these situations. I mean, truly, this was one of the best Renekton games I've watched in a long time. This was finals MVP. This is world finals MVP Kingen back and ready to rumble, and I'm really happy for it. I'm not expecting him to re-break out here. I still think his best year was 2022. Like, that DRX team in 2022 was just so magical. That summer split for him was just so different. Like, he was so consistently good in lane, and he's never really been like that anywhere else in his career. Whether it's been on Hanwha Life, whether it's been on DK here, even before he went to DRX when he was on, Billy Gaming and teams back in the LPL. He had never really been that consistent of a laner, and, I'm not expecting him to get back to that, but the flashes are very much still there, and this series was a flash of that. He was awesome this week for DK in general. And Lucid, man, he just continues to look really good. 3 games of Vi, 3 back-to-back-to-back Vi games. He looked great in all of them. He's a great facilitator, and he stepped up at being able to create for both Kingen and Aiming in terms of being able to take over the game. Really good stuff from him there. Showmaker continues to look great. Aiming was awesome here. I think this is one of his better series all year. Again, kind of a KDA warrior, as we've talked about on the channel, kind of similar to Teddy in that regard, where the KDA often looks better than the individual performance itself, but I think Aiming is a little bit more aggressive in the late game, which does give me more confidence that, he's somebody that can transition leads, and he was awesome in this series. The Zeri, the Kalista, both of it looked really good. In the back half, Kellen was amazing on the Renata in game number 3. I actually considered Kellen for player of the series with how good he was. He's often just talked about like he's this horrible player when, as I've said multiple times, I think Kellen and Beryl are very similar in terms of player skill, and obviously their reputations are just entirely different because one is won in the past and one is not won in the past, and so they get these weird dichotomies, but Kellen continues to just be an inconsistent positive for DK. And, you know, if they're going to be a group of 5 that are all playing well, yeah, that's going to be one of the best teams in the LCK. They don't really seem to have a clear weakness right now, and I think that makes them a very dangerous team to deal with. And then for KDF, again, it's hard to be frustrated with losing to DK because they are such a good team, because they do feel so complete right now, and because, you know, Kingin and Aiming had such good performances in this series. You're not going to have to play against that super regularly in a lot of other circumstances, but it is a bit concerning how bad the bot lane was in this series. Both Leaper and Ondo were horrible against DK, and they were, quite frankly, the only reason KDF could not compete in any of these games, because Bulldog was actually really good in this series. I think Dudu and Cuz were generally fine. Dudu could have been a bit better. Kingin was definitely better on the other side of that matchup, but Leaper and Ondel were horrible. I mean, truly atrociously horrible. And this actually does scarily remind me of Bull and Ondel from last split, where it's like, ooh, fresh new thing. They come in the first couple of weeks and they look really good, and no team knows, you know, how to scout against them or play against them because they weren't prepared for this. And then as the split continues to go on, things get a little worse and worse and worse and worse, and all of a sudden it starts to explode. I compared Ondel earlier this week to Ignar. I think that that's a super apt comparison in terms of play style. And, you know, unfortunately, when Leaper's not playing well, Ondel's going to look bad. Leaper's actually going to get dead of the series for me. I think he individually played worse. Even if Ondel was a little bit worse in terms of scoreline, in terms of KDA, I think Leaper individually was significantly worse in terms of the production that he had in the game itself. He was out of position, getting caught out regularly, just a target for DK, and his inexperience really came back to bite him. We've been praising him as a player who is playing well above his station right now, but this felt like a return back to earth, and Ondel also was really horrible. So the bot lane has to be able to survive if KDF wants to be able to compete at the top level, which I think at this point is their goal. I think their goal is to compete for Worlds, and if that's the case, Leaper and Ondel can't have performances like this against DK. Again, Bulldog was really good, and I think that is a nice takeaway, and it is DK, so you're not going to freak out about the loss, but, you know, 4-2 I think is a little bit of like a, it's a 1 foot in, 1 foot out kind of thing for KDF. You're a little bit happy about that if you're a KDF fan, but you kind of wonder what could have been if you were a little bit more clinical in this series. But for DK on the other side, they look great. Like, they look like a clear Worlds team right now. They look better than Hanwha Life in terms of consistency. They're at 5-1. They truly are a team that I'm expecting to keep this up. And right now, like I said earlier in this week, what's really stopping them from being a team that competes for top 2? With a team like T1 being kind of inconsistent, they showed last split in the LCK playoffs that they're not unbeatable in a best of 5. Like, DK is talented enough to be able to make that leap, especially because it seems like they just keep getting better. Alright, but that is going to do it for my LCK week number 3 overview and analysis video. Up on the screen now, you're going to see the updated standings after 3 weeks of action here in the LCK. Any ties will just be broken alphabetically. I'm not trying to show any favoritism here. Typically speaking, this would be the point where I say in the first column to the right, under power rank, you can see how I personally power rank these teams from number 1 to number 10, and you can see how they have changed from last week to this week, but no changes. And I don't know if that's going to shock some people, but honestly, I didn't see anything this week that really made me feel super different about any of these teams. T1 lost, yes, and you know, I guess there might be some people that are worried about them, but I don't feel good enough to take them out of the top 2. I certainly would expect them to make finals. I already had DK at 3, and they're clearly the 3rd best team in the league. KDF still has an upward battle to try and be a top 4 team, but I'm not entirely sold on KT Rolster jumping them just because they finally won some games this week. DRX is still by far the most interesting of the bottom 4 teams, even if they had a really rough week because of the quality of opponents that they ended up facing. And then Nongshim and Bro are bottom 2. Like, you know, the power rankings don't need to be changed. They are spot on. Like, it was exactly as anticipated this week, and so there are no changes. Let me know if you agree or you disagree with that down in the comment section below. Is there a team that you would have changed the ranking of, and who am I too high or too low on? Would love to know your thoughts and opinions on everything down there. But with that being said, it's time to move on to my player of the week and my dud of the week here in week number 3. Player of the week was a very easy choice for me. It's going to go to Canyon, the jungler for Gen.G. The dude is just absolutely dominating right now in a way that nobody else in the world is. This is a perfect meta for him where he can play things like Nidalee and Karthus and just power farm and take over games in the back half, or, you know, control and affect the games early. Like, it doesn't really matter. He's just really, really good at being the one that's in the driver's seat out of the jungle role. I think this meta fits him a lot better than the metas the last 2 years, and also I think he's gotten his confidence back and he's playing with a team that's a bit better, and there are just so many factors that are boosting up Canyon's, you know, individual performances, and it's turning him into the best jungler in the world once again. The jungler that, for my money, at his peak in 2020 and in 2021, is the best jungler of all time. And so really happy to be able to see him continue that form from spring. And then the honorable mentions, the runners-up, Kingen came very close for me. He is the top laner, of course, for DK. He was awesome this week, man. He just won every single lane matchup he was in and really dominated the late games. Like, that Renekton performance, the Rumble performance in their first series, like, he just had a couple of really awesome games this week that I'm really excited to see. Hopefully he can keep that up. And then Pioshik, obviously kind of an up and down week for Pioshik. He had a couple of games that were but the games that he won, he like straight up just won. And KT Rolster with those 2 wins, they needed him this week, and he really did show up. So those are my honorable mentions, but my player of the week is Canyon, and my dud of the week, unfortunately, is going to go to Guger, the support for Nongshim. He's just not good. Like, again, it continues to raise the questions of what were they thinking in the offseason bringing him back. I understand that he's kind of got a legacy in this organization if you want to consider Dynamics and Nongshim RedForce one org, which I think a lot of people tend to do because of the rebrand, but, you know, I just still don't understand why he is starting. He is clearly not good enough to be in the LCK, and he hasn't played in 4 years. There are so many questions because there are so many good supports at this level and, you know, at a lower level that deserve a spot in the LCK, and Guger has one over them. So he's a pretty easy choice for Dead of the Week, and Canyon is going to get my Player of the Week for week number 3, but that is going to do it. I do hope you guys enjoyed. If you did, leave a like. It really does mean a lot. Lets me know you guys are enjoying the content, and it does help get this video out to a lot more people, which I'm always very appreciative of. If you're new here, hit the subscribe button. We don't only post about the LCK on this channel. We post about all 4 of the major regions. That's the LCS, LEC, LCK, and the LPL every single week on this channel, and the NACL, Tier 2 over in North America. So if you're interested in a comprehensive overview of everything going on in LoL Esports, this is the place for it. Hit subscribe and hit that bell so you can be notified when those videos do go live. But of course, with all that being said, I hope you all are having a great day. I hope you continue to have a great day, and I will see you all later.